Welcome back to It's a Crime. I'm your host, Margaret McLean, and I'm broadcasting live from the East Coast to the West Coast, Boston to LA on KCAA, NBC News Radio 1050, and itsacrimeradio.com. You can always go to my website at itsacrimeradio.com and look at all the blogs, look at the past shows. We've been talking about anything from drones to serial killers to the McStay family disappearance. You name it, it's on itsacrimeradio.com. Right now, let's delve into our second hour of It's a Crime, where we'll take an in-depth look at securities fraud, identity theft, and Ponzi schemes. Joining me is Jenice Malecki. She's a New York-based securities attorney and has been a FINRA arbitrator and chairperson. Malecki's practice areas include securities litigation, regulation and arbitration, securities, and high-level executive employment issues. Commercial litigation and real estate investments. She's a Today Show contributor, Fox News. She's been quoted in the Wall Street Journal. She's everywhere. Jenice, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start out by talking a little bit about what we talked a little bit earlier today, but I'd like to talk about what are some of the consumer complaints out there that you have to deal with in your practice?
Well, I generally deal with investment-related issues. And so what I deal with is people that deal with financial professionals in one capacity or another who are selling them some sort of a product. And I think the biggest complaints that I get from investors is that they really didn't understand what they were getting into. And that's a big problem, because if you don't understand the investment, it's hard for you to accept the risk level of the investment. If it is a legitimate investment, sometimes you don't understand the investment because it's not really an investment at all, and you're being defrauded. So, that's kind of the two ways things tend to go. I mean, there's probably 18 or 20 different types of securities fraud that I do on a regular basis, but everything kind of comes to the core of people not really understanding what they're getting into.
Okay, and who's not explaining to these people what they're getting into? I mean, are these people primarily dealing with broker-dealers, or are they trading online somehow? Where's the disconnect?
Well, I deal with people that usually have a financial professional, so a registered rep at a broker-dealer. And so, the issue with understanding the investment, first of all, some things are more simple to understand than other things. I mean, but even though something like you may understand what a stock is, but when you're purchasing a stock, there's a lot of factors that you have to consider. You have to consider the risk of the market that stock trades in, the risk of the economy at that time, what the market for that sector is. And, so even something as simple as, buying a stock may be more complicated than somebody initially understood. Same thing with mutual funds. Then we have a lot of structured products today, things that are so complex. I can tell you that I've done thousands of arbitrations probably, and I can tell you that I've cross-examined brokers that I'm quite sure themselves didn't understand the product. So,
I'm sure.
Yeah. So, it's the same thing, prospectuses. I can tell you that, not only don't investors generally read prospectuses, and I don't know that they should be required to read a prospectus because, it may be above their education level, and then you have a broker sometimes that doesn't read it themselves. And, there could be certain features, conversion features in an investment that if you don't understand, you may be facing that conversion issue down the market. You don't even know it because the person that you're talking to doesn't understand it themselves.
Exactly. Now, what about hedge funds? Have you had any clients that have had problems with hedge fund investments in certain hedge funds? I know that the regulations are kind of quirky regarding hedge funds. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, back in July of 2011, certain Dodd-Frank Amendment changes to the hedge fund world have occurred. And hedge funds are now required, the advisors to hedge funds, most hedge funds, not all, but I'd say the vast majority of them, are now required to be investment advisors under the Investment Advisor Act of 1940. So what that means is that an industry that was highly unregulated has just gotten very highly regulated. In fact, we know that an investment advisor is a fiduciary to a client, and so the SEC has actually been investigating things like the fees and expenses charged by hedge funds and those types of things to see, whether or not, and all of the ways that the hedge fund is being paid by some of the investments that it's taking. So, for example, investors sometimes don't know that there is soft dollar commissions, there are special bonuses and incentives for a hedge fund to buy a certain investment or take a certain position. And so, they're now, because of the Investment Advisor Act being applicable to the advisors, to the hedge funds, being required to disclose more information, not only about the commissions, but about their trading strategies, their risk parameters, the hedges, and the sort of leverage that they're taking, so that somebody knows more about the real risks they're facing. I think one of the big problems that I've seen with hedge funds is, not often, I think that anybody can get in a hedge fund that they didn't understand the risk level. If they're investing directly in the hedge fund, it's probably a harder case that, about, whether or not it was suitable for them and they understood it. However, what we see, and I call it sort of, the fast food of the investment world, is that you see these firms create these programs, hedge fund programs. So let's just call it hedge entry. I'm making that up. But they'll have a new platform called hedge entry. And what that is a hedge fund won't take you if you have less than $1 million, $2 million, $5 million, whatever. But what the brokerage firms are doing is they are pooling together investors who don't have that kind of money and providing a platform through their broker-dealer to sell it to people who, in my opinion, probably should have never been in the first place because they didn't have enough money to invest in it directly. So they're indirectly providing a method for them to invest in something that's obviously speculative. You should probably be an accredited investor, but the way that they're doing it through these investment advisory programs, a lot of investors are misled in the way that they are gaining access to these hedge funds. They go through these programs and these questionnaires are like mathematical. There's no way they're scoring answers to like very, very open-ended questions like, would you like to make more money? And where do you see yourself in 10 years? And, you can't really get into an investment, in my opinion, that way that is appropriate for you. You need to understand it more fully, but they're providing what I would call the fast food method.
Right, and we're up on our first break, so we will be right back. I want to get into this topic in more detail, so hold on, listeners. We'll be right back after this brief messages. Welcome back to It's a Crime. I'm your host, Margaret McLean, broadcasting live from the East Coast to the West Coast, Boston to LA on KCAA, NBC News Radio 1050, and itsacrimeradio.com. We're in our second hour of It's a Crime, where we're taking an in-depth look at securities fraud, identity theft, and Ponzi schemes with Jenice Malecki, who is a New York-based securities attorney. And Thank you. Very informational here. I'm learning a lot. I also teach law, but I'm enjoying this very much. And we have a caller with a question for you.
Great.
I believe it's Derek. So, Derek, can you hear us?
Yes. Hello?
Yes, Derek, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes.
Thank you for calling.
Yeah, great show. I listen to it all the time. I do have a question. I heard you talking about securities fraud and Ponzi schemes and with your guest and I'm sorry, your guest name is Jenice, is that right?
Jenice, yes.
Yeah, hi, Jenice. I was involved. I'm curious whether or not you talk about. I heard you talk about hedge funds and whatnot. Do you do any work looking into any private REITs or non-traded REITs, real estate investment trusts?
Yeah, we handle a lot of different products, and one of the things, I've been doing this for 22 years, and I can tell you that there's always some new type of product, and there's always changes, and there's one point where limited partnerships was a big scandal, and REITs come into play, and PICs, and all of those types of things. So yeah, there's a lot of different structured products that we've worked with over the years. But
reason I ask is I was involved in one a few years ago, and when I look back on it, I lost some money, not a lot of money, but some money. And I looked into the fees, huge fees. I think they add up to 16 or 17%. Who controls those fees? How do they get away with that?
Well, the managers, typically that should be set in the offering material, and that should be disclosed in the offering material. If it wasn't disclosed, that would be material non-disclosure, in my opinion. I would say, though, that, they can change those documents from time to time, but they have to send you notice of that, and they have to follow certain steps in order to do that. But, one of the things, I don't know if it was sold to you by someone or you directly invested in it. Yes, it was. But, yeah, I mean, I'm sure it may have been in the prospectus, but boy, like you said earlier, these prospectuses are so thick you don't have time to read them. You don't even have time, but it's very complicated. I mean, I've sat in arbitration hearings and I've had brokers. I've asked them, can you point out where the fees are? And you could wait for 30 minutes. The town just goes, forget it, we get the point. Because they don't know where it is. They've never looked at it, and they don't know how to read it half the time. I mean, a broker doesn't even have to go to college. They could just be a high school grad, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but you have to at least be self-educated, and I think some of them aren't. They take it as a sales position, and, that was something, just to stay on your topic, I mean, because I could go off on many different angles of it, but that's something that should have been disclosed to you because it affects the outcome of the investment. So it's just for you to fully understand and accept the recommendation to go into that, you should have known the implication of the fees because it's going to erode away at whatever benefits you get from the investment. So,
I realize that
losses, yeah. So I think that's something that should have been, discussed with you at the time that the investment was made.
But I guess my question with the fees, I guess the sponsor of whatever investment vehicle it is, they can set any fee they want. I guess it's up to. And I guess does the SEC or the FINRA group do they limit any fees, or is it up to?
Well, with these types of investments, it's more of a matter of contract. So you have to look at the documents they provided you with and see what it says. I mean, obviously, the fees can't be charged in such a way that it becomes a fraud. So, for example, it's like a no-win situation. The way the fees are structured, there's no way for somebody to possibly make any money on this investment. Because that would be, even if they disclosed it all, it would operate as a fraud in reality.
Right.
So, there's no set limit per se, but, it has to make sense and it has to be not in conflict with both the documents and the best interests of the investors.
I see. Okay.
I see.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Great questions. Thank you, Derek, for the question, and thank you for listening to It's a Crime.
Thank you. Love the show. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Jenice, I've got a question. Let's say you're an investor who lost money because of bad advice or unsuitable investment recommendations, misconduct. How do you seek to recover those losses?
Well, really, you need to take private action. You can file a complaint with FINRA, the Financial Regulatory Authority that regulates brokers and brokerage firms. You can also file a complaint with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is a United States government entity. But those two things are generally going to get the person disciplined, not necessarily going to get you restitution. They sometimes require restitution, but not always. In the vast majority of the cases, they tell an investor, we may investigate this, but you should seek your own attorney to get your money back. So then when they hire an attorney, you basically, at the time that you sign a contract with a broker-dealer to open a new account, there is an arbitration provision embedded in that contract. I have never seen in 22 years one that did not have one embedded in it. Also, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because arbitration can be quicker and less expensive.
Absolutely.
You arbitrate at FINRA, the Financial Regulatory Authority that regulates the brokers. There used to be many forms, but it's all gotten condensed down to one. And even if you didn't sign that agreement, under the FINRA Constitution and bylaws, any customer has the right to elect to arbitrate against the broker-dealer at their desire. but it doesn't go the other way. So if they didn't get a contract, the broker-dealer can't, force you into arbitration if you didn't sign away your rights. Because they're regulated, they have to abide by that rule. Arbitration is... Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, I'm sure you've represented many clients in these arbitrations, and can you just tell us a little bit what it's about? And, of course, you're with Malecki Law in New York, which
yes.
I've got to keep saying that because you really are, you know your stuff here. So we got to make sure we keep Malecki Law in New York. Do you also, I know on a side, and I want you to answer my question in a second, but do you primarily take clients in New York or throughout the country as well?
I take clients throughout the country as permitted by the laws of the state.
Okay.
If I'm not allowed to in that state and I want to take the case, I can always associate with local counsel and get pro hoc viced in, which means that the state will recognize me for the purposes of that case. So we do nationwide. I have represented people all around the country. I've represented people out of the country as well. But arbitration is a forum where, you can basically, from the time a client walks into my door until we get an award, I'd say the process takes anywhere between a year and a half. If somebody's elderly or sickly, they basically require that the arbitration panel have a decision within 9 months. And it's a lot less expensive than going to court. Although you have to pay for every day of the arbitration hearing, basically, you don't have to pay for depositions and a lot of the things that make court so expensive. And it's not going to go on. I mean, I've had legal colleagues who've had cases go on for 11 years for appeal. That doesn't really happen with arbitration. While there's a way to move to vacate, it's very hard. It almost never works. And even that process is expedited. And a broker-dealer has to pay you within 30 days of the award or they lose their license. So they all pay, which is nice. You don't have to chase someone if you win a case to actually get the payment for the wrongdoing. But arbitration is like a court hearing. It's just a little less formal. It happens in a conference room, not in a courtroom. You get a panel of 3 arbitrators. And there's opening statements, closing statements, witnesses, documents, cross-examination, everything, objections, everything that's in a normal court hearing. But it's a little less formal and a little more expedited.
Okay, and obviously you can't call an attorney every time the value of your portfolio goes down or you lose money on a stock. Can you give us an idea of when you really should get out there and call an attorney and go through the arbitration process? When would the red flags come up where you would be suspicious of some sort of misconduct, where you would say, oh, you know what, this is wrong and I'm going to call Malecki Law?
If you have an investment that isn't performing the way that you understood it would perform, if things are happening with the investment that you didn't expect, if your statements don't make sense to you, you don't really understand the way it's laid out, and you're not getting answers from your broker, he's not returning your calls, or she's not returning your calls, or I think the market's doing well and you're really doing poorly. You really should start looking at things. I mean, most lawyers will give you a consultation for free. We give free consultations all the time. And, it can't hurt to have somebody look at it. If you have any level, even, I always say follow your gut. And,
right.
I don't know how this is going to sound, but a lot of husbands come in and always say, I should have listened to my wife. She never felt right about this broker. And I hate the way that sounds, particularly as a woman saying that, but, I think that you have to listen to when things just don't feel right. Sometimes, it doesn't hurt to ask a lawyer, and most of the time it doesn't cost anything. Like in New York, I know that the New York State Bar Association has a referral service, and, it's like $35 for a consultation. So, there are so many ways for you to get information, and there's no reason not to. And I would say anytime a broker asks you to sign something that says you say you have the opportunity to consult legal counsel before you sign it, you sure as well better consult legal counsel at that point. Because that's a red flag right there. I think that anytime your investment isn't performing, you see margin or you see minus signs on your statement that you you had no idea that you had a loan, or you don't understand why there are minus signs or numbers in brackets.
You know, exactly. Let's talk about the margins when we get back from this break. We're, of course, up on our next break. And another thing I want to talk about is whether or not to join the class actions, whether you're better off to go individually, call an attorney like you, or be part of a big, massive class action. So we'll be right back to discuss those issues. This is Margaret McLean on It's a Crime, and we have a few brief messages. We'll be right back. Welcome back to It's a Crime. I'm your host, Margaret McLean, and we're talking about securities fraud and Ponzi schemes. We haven't gotten to the Ponzi schemes yet. We're here with Jenice Malecki, who is a renowned New York-based securities attorney from Malecki Law, and I'm going to spell that for you, Malecki. She also has a wonderful blog that I was reading on the train today. I came back from New York City. The blog is aboutsecuritieslaw.com. Again, that's aboutsecuritieslaw.com. She has many interesting articles that if you're investing, whether it's in a hedge fund or anything, very good to read, because she'll give you an idea of what an arbitration is like. She'll give you an idea of what your rights are, when you should consult an attorney. So that is actually an excellent blog. And I'm a lawyer, too. I will have to say it's very easy to read, and I teach law at Boston College, so I'm going to tell my students about your blog, Jenice. I
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Well, it's
hard.
Very...
I think educating the public is really important. I mean, it's just so important.
Yes.
I think people should learn some of this stuff in high school, because as soon as you're out in the real world, you know, I always tell clients, you're a squirrel in the woods with your nuts, and if you leave them unattended for a moment, somebody will come and take them.
Oh, I know. It's so important. As a matter of fact, my daughter is a junior. She's looking at colleges, and they don't offer a course in basic investment. I think it would be great to have a basic finance course so they know what the stock market's all about. They know, just the real basics, but they're really not doing that. And I did hear of one high school which had a great course in investments, but again, it's only one course that I've heard of. So you're right, and they should. Granted, the business school students take investment and finance, but I think it should be part of the general curriculum at this point. It's so important.
Really is.
Jenice, yes. And before the break, we started a little bit talking about margins. I would like to warn the public about the danger of margining an account.
Yeah, I mean,
can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. What most people don't understand about margin is that it's not like a loan on your home. And it's funny because I sit in these arbitration hearings, and the brokers sort of lead the clients through their statements and try to make the panels, the arbitration panels, believe that they understood margin because they have a mortgage on their home. Well, you know what? That's just wrong. Okay, because a mortgage on your home now. Well, we've seen over the last few years, the last 5 or 6 years, that people have their homes going underwater, meaning that the loans are larger than the value of the property. For the most part, those houses, those people stay in those houses if they can make their monthly payments, okay? With margin, there are certain leverage requirements. And so as the value of your position starts to fall, you get what's known as margin calls, and you have to put more money into your account or you lose what you were holding, okay? So once you lose something that you were holding, the recovery of that account is astronomically difficult, because you're going to have to make multiples of what you already had made in the past to get yourself back to where you just started. I don't know if that's clear enough, but basically, I have heard many times clients say, I got these things called margin calls. I didn't know anything about it. Again, it was that at the outset, when the investments were first chosen, and the investment strategies, and margin is an investment strategy, leveraging, using your portfolio to get more, so you can buy, a third more of the stock, let's say, than you could have bought with the money you had. And a lot of brokers will tell the good side of it, but not the bad side of it. And the bad side of it is, as the market drops, you have to put more money in, and a lot of people don't have that extra money to put in, or you lose a position and it becomes impossible to ever recover. So, that's just another example of, you really have to understand what's going on in the account. And,
exactly.
Most people trust their brokers. And so, unfortunately, that's something that's sometimes preyed upon.
Exactly. I know people who were absolutely killed by margin calls after 2008. They just lost so much money and had to sell their houses and all that type of thing. But I think it's a danger. I know, me, I would never do it. I'm a cautious investor, I guess. But
even if you bought something that was a very stable company or something that seemed like a blue chip, brokers love to use the term blue chip. Right?
Sure.
But if you buy a blue chip, and the blue chip is only blue chip assuming that nothing bad happens to the sector, that nothing bad happens to the economy, that there's no fraud going on in the company, and you have to always account for it. This is why, over-concentration, nobody ever thinks about over-concentration, but you can have too much of a good thing. Because they have one bad story. They have, like Toyota that had, the problem with the brakes in the cars, or whatever it is, and it could affect, a company in such a way that it could take a huge dip, and it may only be temporary, or it may not. But the fact of the margin will cause a sellout, and you will lose and never really be able to recover. So it makes something that may not have been a really long-term risky security into a high-risk investment. It adds, it at least doubles the risk factor of whatever investment you're taking on.
What happens as far as the class action? Should you go with the big class actions, or are you better off individually suing in certain situations?
It depends on your loss size, and it depends on who you would be suing. So there's really two things to consider. You have you have to do like a cost-benefit analysis about the class action. If your loss is small, and I think that in a case, under $50,000, under $100,000, very hard to even bring in arbitration for the smaller numbers, okay? Because once the fees and costs of either arbitration, of even just arbitration, can be high, and so you have to think about whether or not, it makes sense to just go with a class action. You're only going to get cents on the dollar. That is what's going to happen with the class action. So, a $100,000 case, you can probably get through an arbitration. A $50,000 case, it depends on your circumstances as well, So if you could afford the fees, it may be better to do the private action. But if it was in court, so let's say the issuer, the company, was at fault for this class action, and you had to sue them in court to recover, you really need like a $500,000 loss at a minimum to make it worth bringing your own action. Because the cost and the time factor is going to be overwhelming to bring your own action. So, but certainly if you have $100,000 worth of losses, $200,000, $300,000 worth of losses, and you can go to arbitration, you certainly would fare better there because you're probably likely to get a higher recovery if you win than what you would get in a class action.
But I don't understand that. Why would you get a higher recovery if you sued individually versus the class action?
These class actions tend to settle, and they settle at a lower, well, first of all, the attorneys take very large sums in the class actions. The costs of administering a class action are huge. There's all kinds of publication requirements, notice and mailing requirements to thousands of, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of victims, depending on the size of the class action. Class actions are always in court. They're never in arbitration. They're not permitted in arbitration. So you have 40, 50 depositions sometimes in those types of cases. The costs rack up. And they tend to settle on a lower percentage. It's hard to say why. It's almost like the class actions help the companies continue on a cost-benefit analysis to engage in the wrongful conduct, in my opinion.
Oh, okay. I've been on your, I'm skipping around a little bit here, but I was on your blog about securitielaw.com on the train, as I mentioned, and I'm actually interested in the Jeffrey Brett Rubin case that you talk about on the blog. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then, of course, we have a break in about 2 minutes, but at least maybe we can start with it.
Yeah, we blog about a lot of individual cases. That was not a case that we handled in our office. That was a case that we were actually just talking about, which was a news story. So, we handle a lot of different news stories on a regular basis. And I believe that was something that one of my associates had written about. So I don't have too much commentary on that one.
Oh, okay. That's all right. For anybody interested, though, it's a very interesting blog about Rubin, who there were 31 NFL players involved, and I guess Rubin sold investments away from Lincoln Financial Advisors Corporation. But all in all, then there was investment in a casino, so it sounds like a lot of hanky-panky. But if you go to the blog about securitielaw.com, you can read about it if you're interested.
Well, I could tell you that in selling away, first of all, lotto winners and sports professionals and celebrities often get duped because they don't have time to really look at everything. And a lot of them have no connection to the finance industry. And then selling away is a big problem that often, we find involves Ponzi schemes. And that was something that maybe we can, talk more about. Because I think it's very interesting. People don't know what redress they have for Ponzi schemes.
Okay, so let's do that. We're up on our last break here, so when we come back, let's talk about Ponzi schemes. Of course, I promised to the listeners we'd talk about Ponzi schemes, so we should cover it here. And I also remember on the Today Show, you talked about the thing. I'm right on that. That was you, right?
That was me.
Oh, good. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that as well. I happened to catch that. So we will be right back on It's a Crime with Margaret McLean after these.
Welcome back to It's a Crime. I'm your host, Margaret McLean, and I'm broadcasting live from the East Coast to the West Coast, Boston to LA on KCAA, NBC News Radio 1050, and itsacrimeradio.com. Joining me today, of course, is Jenice Malecki. She is a New York-based securities attorney from Malecki Law. She has a blog called About Securities law.com. If you're interested in this stuff, I'd strongly suggest it. It was great reading for me on the train, as I've mentioned. I really do find this stuff fascinating. And it's not the legal mumbo-jumbo that you see in a lot of these sites. It really is addressed to the consumer, to the client. If you feel that you've lost money in your investments, you feel you've been frauded somehow, check it out, aboutsecuritielaw.com, or give Jenice Malecki a call at Malecki Law. And Jenice, for our last segment here, we're going to be talking about Ponzi schemes. Tell us a little bit about them.
Well, as we know, there's been a lot of Ponzi schemes in the news in the last 5 or 6 years, at least. And there's always traditionally been Ponzi schemes from time to time that we see. I mean, it comes from Charles Ponzi back in, I think, the 1800s, whereas the term was coined. But Ponzi schemes generally are where you're solicited into some type of an investment, and they're characterized in different ways: notes, loans, investments, and basically, like, they need to get new money in order to pay the old investors their interest. So you're promised like a guaranteed rate of return, 10%, and it's usually above what you can get in the market. That's how they solicit people in. And it's, your principal is protected, you're going to get this amount of interest, and they really need to get new victims constantly to pay the interest to the old victims. And they often, keep these older victims into, and I don't mean senior citizens because everybody gets involved in this, but the initial victims in by having them roll the investments over or having long-term investments. So most, Bernie Madoff is, of course, the big news example that everybody has heard of. But there's been a lot of them, and there's a lot of local Ponzi schemes. I think every state is, has been plagued by these things. So, one of the things that I would like to, kind of educate people to is if you've been a victim of a Ponzi, a lot of people feel really helpless. Like there's no way to get any recovery. The money's been stolen. And that's, well, it's true that the money's been stolen, but there's not always no way to get recovery. Because some of these Ponzi schemes are actually perpetrated by people who are an investment professional of one type or another who had whose broker-dealer or other investment professional organization, like an investment advisory or an insurance company, had a responsibility to supervise the office through which these investments were made out of. And so, for example, we had a case in our office where there was a Ponzi schemer who had one of those one-stop shopping financial offices where you could get your taxes done there, you could buy insurance there, you could buy securities there, and you could also buy his homemade investment, which was a Ponzi scheme there.
Now, how long did this guy operate, Jenice?
Oh, he operated from the 1980s.
It sounds like Bernie Madoff, where people eventually they trusted him. I just don't get how these people thrive.
It's because they play on trust. So in this particular case, he was their accountant for many, many years, but it was like really a white, like a blue collar neighborhood, people who, had, like the salt of the earth people who had all of their retirement money taken. They didn't have a ton of money. I mean, some of them had large losses, but it was like a lifetime of savings, payoffs for retiring early, things where they'd never really be able to recover. And it's shocking because he did know them for, decades in some cases. He defrauded his own family. So, these people tend to be somewhat sociopathic, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah.
So, what I'd say is that sometimes there is an avenue for recovery. And, again, it doesn't hurt to consult an attorney, but you have to find an attorney who knows this area of the law. Because even some attorneys, we've represented a lot of Ponzi victims, a lot. And we've gotten substantial recoveries for Ponzi victims. But we know exactly where to look and where to, find where we can find the recoveries. And so, for example, if the person who sold you this as an alternative to mutual fund, and they were able to sell you a mutual fund through a broker-dealer, it means that they likely were a branch office, even if it was their own office, with their own name on the door. Technically, under the laws and the rules applicable to registered representatives, that office had to be supervised as if it was in the main office of the broker-dealer. There is no difference. If they sell you a product from his office or from their main office, the same supervisory responsibilities apply. And so that would be completely, the responsibility of the broker-dealer if somebody sold you a Ponzi investment, okay? And so, it's important to know that there are avenues for you to potentially recover, but you have to really find an attorney that knows what they're talking about to get some sort of a recovery in those circumstances. Because, because we've had so many victims, we've had people come to us who went to other attorneys who, didn't really understand the machinations, and they were suing the wrong people. You don't sue the Ponzi victim, you're never going to get any money back from a Ponzi victim. You have to look for somewhere that's a legitimate financial institution that had a responsibility to you. Even though you may have never known that broker-dealer was part of the investment process, it doesn't matter. You may not have opened an actual account. There's something called selling away, which we were just talking about the NFL players. When a broker sells away an investment, they have to get the approval of the broker-dealer. If they didn't get the approval, the broker-dealer had an obligation to supervise to make sure that type of activity wasn't going on. And they have to provide reasonable measures, and they have to, a lot of times there's big red flags. Like one of the Ponzi cases that we had, there were brochures all over the office. He had like a closed-circuit TV talking about the investment in his office. It was clear to us that no one from the broker-dealer went in and did any audit, and if they did, they had to be Mr. Magoo, not being able to speak or hear anything in front of them. So, there's really some avenue for redress in many cases. In some cases, there's not. But you should always make sure that you're investing through a reputable company. And there's a lot of homework you can do. You can go to the FINRA website. You can check out your broker. There's something called Broker Check. You can make sure he doesn't have any complaints against him or her. And you could consult attorneys and other people to make sure that, what you're doing makes sense for you. And I know it sounds odd to consult an attorney in some of these instances, but particularly when the investment requires you to sign documents that are not normal in a securities transaction. Because you buy a mutual fund, you're not going to have to sign away your rights or sign something that says you've consulted an attorney to buy a mutual fund. So really, you have to ask questions. As consumers in America, we're more polite to people who defraud us than we are to some of our neighbors in some instances. We don't want to admit we don't understand something, but we should. We don't want to ask questions and seem like, we don't understand it, but you should. There's nothing stupid about asking questions. It's really important to do so. And, it's not impolite to ask questions. And, you really, when you're going into something exotic, you really need a lot of money to take risks. And, if you don't have that kind of money, you shouldn't be embarrassed to tell your broker, maybe I don't have enough money to do that. I don't want to take any risks. So, we have to, probably ask more pointed questions to some of these people.
Well, Jenice, it's been a pleasure, and I've certainly learned something here. And Jenice practices in New York for Malecki Law. However, she has clients all over the country, and I, of course, have listeners on the Internet. I have listeners in Boston and in the Los Angeles area. So if you think you could be a victim of securities fraud or, a Ponzi scheme, feel free to contact Jenice through Malecki Law, or go to that blog, aboutsecuritieslaw.com, and it gives you so much information on Ponzi schemes or what you should do. It tells about arbitration. Thank you so much, Jenice, for being a guest on It's a Crime and for giving us all this wonderful information.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yes, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. And for all the listeners out there, we will be back. This is Margaret McLean on It's a Crime. The West Coast will be back from noon to 2 every Saturday.